As many of you will know, he's a historian of late medieval Southern Europe, with a particular focus on the port city of Marseille. Just to take one example of his voluminous scholarship, some of you might have read his Legal Plunder, Households and Debt Collection in Late Medieval Europe, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. Interestingly, he's also written extensively on so-called deep human history, including on Deep History in the Brain, University of California Press, 2008, and with Andrew Shirok and others, Deep History, the Architecture of Past and Present. In 2021, he was also instrumental in the launching of the documentary Archaeology of Late Medieval Europe, or DALMI project, which was produced in collaboration with Gabriele Pizzorno and Laura Moreale, as well as others. This is the project he's going to be talking about today. Those of you who've looked at the chat will find the link, dalmi.org, and you should all feel free to click on that and look at the various sections he's referring to during his talk. So without further ado, I'll pass the virtual mic over to Professor Smail, who will speak to us on the topic of the documentary Archaeology of Late Medieval Europe, a contribution to digital scholarship.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stuart. I hope my presentation is now showing. It's really great to be here. I'm really pleased to have a chance to contribute to this Digital Humanities Initiative project, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Dr. McManus asked me to speak about this DALMI project that he mentioned in the introduction. This is the project I've been leading for about a year or so with the project team here at Harvard, probably about last 5 years ago. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm a historian of Europe in the centuries before about 1600. I do mostly social and legal history based on archival documents. So I spent a lot of time in Europe's archives. This particular project I've been leading, there's the webpage. I've been leading with Gabriele Pizzorno, who's our principal digital historian. He's the actual the technician who codes and gets things done behind the scenes. And I also work with Laura Moreale. She's the other PI on this project. So it has two goals. The first is to disseminate transcriptions of household inventories and other lists of material culture from the period we're interested in. And the second one is to create a corpus of texts that are available for geospatial, statistical, and computational analysis. And that's kind of for us, that's sort of the real goal of the project is this digital analysis. Everyone here knows we've got this growing body of toolkits that we can apply to numerical and textual data. Tableau, Gephi, Voyant, the various GIS platforms, those kinds of things. So I think the fundamental point is that these programs work with existing data sets. And I call this the low-hanging fruit problem, namely that these tools of digital scholarship work if you already have the data lined up for you. But how does the data actually come into the form that we can use it? This is a really common problem in history and archaeology and related fields, some of the older literary fields as well, where there's not already machine readable text that's available for analysis. One of the things we've been trying to do is to create a fully actionable data set for the study of material culture in Europe before 1600. So it's sort of it's what lies behind the scenes, what you have to do to create the data set, then you can then apply the platforms to. Most of my remarks are going to focus on the first of these goals, namely how we've actually put together this collection of inventories from the database to the front end. What I'm going to try to do here is just give you some of the behind the scenes a sense of what's going on behind the scenes with this project. So we're currently developing, really right now, developing algorithms that are going to simplify the process of marking up the words in the corpus. That's going to make the analysis much easier. And this is the area that my colleague, Dr. Pizzorno, is the real expert on the team. But in the final section of this talk, I'm just going to give you my sense about what we're doing here. So we have, I've got four main sections. The first one, obviously really important, I want to lay out the intellectual question, which is why study household inventories? What are these records? What are they important for? And then particularly, how can digital approaches contribute to these records? So that's what we'll be doing in the first section. In the second section, I thought it'd be really useful actually to talk about our initial forays into this when we first started working on this in probably seriously around 2014. We used the FileMaker Pro database to develop a proof of concept of what we wanted to get at. So that I'd like to give you a sense of the early history of the project, and in particular, the mistakes that we made or the paths that we went on that we didn't follow. Next, I'm going to walk through the DALM-E environment, focusing on both the back end and on the front end. So the back end, this is all the resources and the data. And then the front end is the website and how it speaks to the back end and presents the information to the public. And then finally, this last section, of which I'll give you again some layman's sense about where we're going with this with the analysis of the material. So Stuart, I think you could, if you would like to see this presentation, which is on Prezi, I think Stuart, you want to share that the link to the Prezi with everyone if you haven't already. That way, if you'd like to jump around in the slides without necessarily following what I'm doing here, that would be fine. And then finally, if there's any, I don't know, technical vocabulary, Stuart or Jeremy, just jump in and interrupt me. I'm happy to explain stuff more clearly. So let's begin with this important question. So why study household inventories? I'd like to give an introduction to the source and describe kind of how historians have used it. So historical archives in the Ottoman world and throughout Europe and the Americas have preserved an extensive corpus of household inventories. And I'm just, sorry, I've just jumped around here. I'm going to give you an example here. This is one that's actually not in our collection right now, but I just thought it was interesting. This is an example from written in Judeo-Arabic from the 16th, 17th century. The household inventories are just lists of contents of households. This particular one has not only lists of contents, but it also gives a price there on the left-hand margin. So the majority of these types of household inventories were made in the context of inheritance or succession to estates. And I understand from talking to colleagues in China and doing some research that this would be similar to, in ancient China, Fendan, Yizu. These are types of documents that emerge from household, the process of household division, Fenjia. So in Europe, the laws that govern succession to estates, to inheritances, go back to the Roman Empire. There's 2,000 years of history here. And they emerge in particular from an extensive body of Roman law governing the practice of guardianship. This is particularly true in the body of law that was laid down in the 6th century. They added a number of protections for guardians for underage children who were inheriting estates. It was pretty clear that the Roman Empire would have created extensive records, but very few survive. There's a few fragments of inventories from the early medieval period, from the period up to about 1000 of the Common Era. The vast majority of those are ecclesiastical inventories or monastic treasuries, things like that. So beginning in the 13th century, in the 1200s, and this is the period on which our own project focuses, we begin to find inventories of secular households in increasing numbers in European archives. And there's a number of factors that cause this kind of takeoff in the production of inventories of secular households. And probably one of the most important, this is a side issue, it's not related to this project per se, but just to give you some sense of the background, is in the 13th century, there's a real emergence of a culture of credit and debt. And it's really clear that this particular culture is creating concerns for guardians for underage children who might be liable for the debts of an estate. And so this is why this Roman law practice comes back into legal practice. So this really what explains this this explosion of secular inventories starting around 1200 or 1250 or so. So those are the post-mortem inventories or the guardianships. There's other types of inventories. They're a little less common, but they're very interesting. Some arise from bankruptcy, other arise from criminal inquest. There's a really interesting inventory in the Dalmy collection of a sex worker, actually the owner of a brothel, who was going off on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Mary in Occitan. So she left an inventory of her brothel behind so that one of her partners could manage it in her absence. And so it has a complete list of the contents of this brothel. So there's a number of other contexts in which we see inventories being produced. So secular inventories surviving from Mediterranean Europe in the 13th century, they probably number in the hundreds or so. This is a map of our records that you can get on the website if you want to go and visit it yourself. It's in under collections and then explore. But here's just a screenshot. I've just pulled out just a few of the places where we have records from the 13th century, from Aix-en-Provence and Marseille, Genoa, and Bologna. So the numbers increased by orders of magnitude all over Europe over the next century or so. So here's our entire corpus. It ranges down from here, Accra, up to the Baltic. The bulk are from this Mediterranean zone right here. We currently have about 500 records from this period that we've published. There's another 500 records in the database that they're in various stages of editing and transcription. And we've identified, we know that there's several thousand more that we could easily get a hold of. It's simply a question of time and resources and getting people involved in the project. So there's all throughout before 1500, which is pretty much what we focus on. There are probably tens of thousands of inventories extant from Europe up to that date. And after that, the numbers soar up into the millions. So when you get into the early modern period, there's just uncountable quantities from the Ottoman world, from Europe, the Americas. The tendency to keep inventories begins to decline by about 1850 for complex reasons having to do with consumption patterns and so on. But you still find inventories from time to time. My colleague, Dr. Pizzorno, is working on a totally different project with colleagues who work on the 20th century, using inventories of property that Nazis had robbed from Jewish households during the Second World War. So they're creating a website to make these really interesting inventories available for people. So Dalmy, we're focused on the period up to about 1500 or so. That just has to do with the expertise and the interests of the project team. It raises a really important point. The technology and the platform that we've developed for these late medieval inventories could be used for inventories anywhere in time and space. You could use it for sources in German, Mandarin, Turkish. You could use it for sources from the ancient world to the present. So in effect, the platform that we've developed is adapted for every type of record that contains a list of things, a list of objects. So we call that platform the Initiative for Documentary Archaeology. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is there's this larger environment of which Dalmy is just one component. We're currently working with a group in Antwerp in Belgium to develop a collection of 16th century inventories from the Low Countries. And we've just put in a grant for inventories of apothecaries and other list of pharmacopoeia from all over the world, from the ancient world to about 1850 or so. So we'll be using the same platform, but totally different front ends for those projects because they're unrelated to the Dalmy project. So let's come back to Europe or so. Before 1350 or so, inventories created in Europe were typically compiled by members or friends of the family. So they were produced by ordinary men and women. I think this is one of the things I find most interesting about them. And they typically were done, people would literally walk through the house and they'd walk through rooms and note down the contents. And they would often include room labels. So here's a picture of one of our inventories. You can see right at the top on the left, there's a list of objects, and the right on the top, there's a Latin word that means in the kitchen of the said house. So we know all these objects are actually in the kitchen. So most inventories were compiled on a room by room basis. Sometimes they don't actually mention the room, but it's possible to infer the room by the contents. If you see a dining table, for example, you can be pretty sure that you're in the dining hall. So as I mentioned, the most common inventory are post-mortem inventories or inventories of guardianships. I would have said about a third or a half the inventories in our collection were done by widows. Inventorying the estates of their late husbands. We also find adult heirs accepting an inheritance from their father. And if the heirs were underage, a guardian would be appointed to kind of compile the inventory. So in a typical scenario, a widow or a guardian walks through the decedent's house and they take note of all the possessions. They literally write it down. So the compiler of the inventory was almost certainly accompanied by members of the household, such as children, relatives, and servants. And in locales where rates of literacy were reasonably high, which is pretty true in many of the cities of Europe, the compiler, in other words, the person responsible for making the inventory, probably wrote out the list of contents on sheets of paper, probably in their own language. And here's an actual example of one. I'm pretty sure this is an example of a record that was kept by someone who made an inventory herself, wrote it down on a piece of paper. This is in the local vernacular Provençal. This is from 1315. But you didn't have to write it down yourself. You could hire a notary or an official scribe to take the notes on an estate for you. And a number of inventories are made by notaries. This is actually a scene of a notary writing here on the left with the document in his lap, making an inventory. You can see the people pointing out the objects. So in the city that I work on, Marseille, and many of the other ones that I work on in Provence, these notes, which were, again, probably in the vernacular, were translated into Latin by the notary and then copied out into a court register. So we have a lot. I would have said about a third or a half the records in the corpus are in Latin. But we also have a lot of inventories of vernacular, such as Italian, Catalan, Occitan. There's close to a dozen languages in the Dalmy collection right now. So up to about 1400 or so, most of the inventories that I know about were produced by members of the family or guardians or executors. And after this point, a growing number of the surviving inventories were produced by family courts concerned with the states. And certainly by the early modern period, most inventories are made by legal officials rather than members of families. So since the late 19th century, inventories have been really important sources for historians of material culture. We're starting. I'm getting now into what, why study these documents. As I was preparing for this, I put together a bibliographic survey of the International Medieval Bibliography on the Brepolis site, which just is a bibliography of the Middle Ages. And because inventories is a subject category, you can easily find lots and lots of secondary sources that study inventories. And you can see from this graph that I've put together that there was a real takeoff of interest in studying inventories starting in the late 80s or 1990s, and it's really taken off lately as more and more scholars have been using inventories for scholarship. So what are they interested in? I won't spend a lot of time on this. It would take us too far away from where we're going. Initially, a lot of the scholarship was about the history of consumption, about changing standards of living. And the goal was to demonstrate how between the medieval period and in the early modern period, there was an explosion of material culture. That's very common. It's a little less common now. Probably the most common technique right now is to look for specific items or categories of items. So fashion historians or clothing historians will look at clothing. There's a lot of book historians and people in literature who will look for books in inventories. Scientific instruments and musical instruments are very common. This is more for the early modern period than the Middle Ages because we don't have that much. Art objects, devotional objects, weapons and tools. I've seen a lot of scholarship based on these things. I'm currently working with a postdoc who's interested in the fact that inventories will sometimes list enslaved people owing to the Mediterranean system of slavery. So these are the history of consumption studies specific things are probably the most important uses of inventories. They're also used for values of things, debt collection. We have people like to collect the inventories of famous or interesting people like Marco Polo, for example. And there's several other things, the written form of the inventory, archival science. There's some used by architectural historians. So the big question, obviously, on all our minds is, so what can digital scholars contribute to the historical questions based on inventories? So I'm going to be saying more about this in the last section, but I thought it'd be helpful to give you some sense of where this presentation is going by discussing some, the kinds of questions, some of the ways in which digital approaches might help. So first of all, just to, if for scholars interested in individual items, it's really clear that the digitization of a substantial corpus of inventories enables comparative approaches to the study of individual items. And I'd like to give you an illustration of this by looking at something I've been studying myself, which is our alembics. We publish very short essays on the Dalmy site periodically. I'll say a little bit more about this later. And so for this recent little essay on alembics, I wrote this, well, I put together this particular essay. An alembic, it's the little, the strange looking brown object here. An alembic is a type of receptacle that's used for distilling alcohol, typically from wine. Right here, if my cursor is working for you, this is where you put the liquid. You place that on something that would heat it up. It would condense here and then drip down this pipe into another receptacle, and that's how you distill alcohol. So the alembic is an Arabic instrument, a scientific instrument in origin. So the alcohol, they were making alcohol not primarily for consumption purposes. They were not making whiskey or gin or anything. Instead, it was, in this period at least, it was used for medical preparations or for rose water, which might be used for bathing the face or the hands or for cooking with. Scholarship on alembics says that the instrument primarily emerged in the 16th century, although in our collection, it's really clear that there's considerable evidence for the use of alembics in private households going back 2 centuries earlier. So while I was working on this essay, I had to find all the alembics in the Dalmy collection. Now, none of our sources right now are translated. We just have transcriptions. And there's, as you can imagine, there's a wide variety of terms that refer to alembics. And what's more, there's no standardized spelling. This is a world that doesn't have dictionaries, and so everyone spells things differently. So in effect, I had to find all the alembics the hard way. I literally did a number of searches for these terms. We have a very powerful search mechanism. These are some of the word forms or the lemata that denote alembics in the Dalmy collection. Um, how could we do this more efficiently? Well, when you approach this as a project of digital scholarship, you start to arrive at these things. Again, I'm going to say more about this later, but I just want to give you some idea where this is heading. Rather than searching painfully for every single term in its original language, one of the things that became clear to us early on is that we wanted to create linkages where all of these particular terms could be linked to a single conceptual entity. And I'll zoom in on here with a barcode that would represent the conceptual entity of alembic. So the idea would be just searching for this thing. You could search for this code. Obviously, we would have a word like alembic that you could search for it, and that would produce. It would allow you to find every single item in the collection that had been tagged in this way. So this is this is one of the for looking for individual objects. This is one of the great advantages of digitizing this collection and then doing this lexicalization process that I've described here. It's going to allow people very rapidly to zero in on the things that they're interested in. One of the other things that digital techniques really lend themselves to are the study of ensembles of objects. And there's three principal analytical techniques for approaching ensembles of objects or assemblages. The first is frequency, or relative frequency, how common something is. The second is co-occurrence, what types of objects co-occur with other types of objects. And the third is spatial location, where they're found. So I'll just walk through this examples of each of these. So first of all, for frequency, all measures of frequency have to be relative measures. So you by definition, you have to measure the frequency of something against a baseline. So in this case, I've just put together for you a representation of the frequency of alembics as a percentage of the total number of inventories from a given region. Just I just gave a few examples here. Here in Occitania and in the Lombard Alps, you don't find them at all. Down here in Catalonia, alembics occur in about 25% of the inventories. There's at least one, 25% have at least one alembic. In the area that I study, in Marseille, it's about 20%. And then over here in Florence, it's much less, about 4%. So in this case, we're just using the total number of inventories from a region as the baseline for measuring the frequency of it. But you might also want to measure the frequency of items in a household compared to other items. So one of the things that Dalmy can do is, because you can, in every single inventory, you can create align items for the total number of objects in a household. You can actually measure the frequency of alembics compared to the total number of objects in a house. The early modern scholar Craig Muldrew has done something very similar when he studied pillows as a sign of growing patterns of luxurious consumption in 16th century England. He was doing measures of the total number of pillows in households. So I'd like you to note some of the implications of this, because among other things, it means that every inventory has to include a metadata field that indicates its location as space. So I'm going to show you an image of this later. We've got a whole setup of georeferences where every single inventory is spatialized. And this what allows us to come up with these particular measures here. Also, by definition, it's kind of obvious, every inventory has to be dated. You can do time series analyses as long as all the inventories are dated in the metadata field. So co-occurrence, that's the next analytical device. This is the kind of technique that tools such as Voyant allow. I don't know actually at this point what alembics co-occur with. I suspect they co-occur with winemaking equipment. but I haven't actually studied this yet. I also think they probably co-occur with items that have some kind of exotic provenance, say from the Near East. And if that's the case, it might imply that some alembics were actually being imported from the Arabic-speaking world. Stay tuned. We'll try to find out this later. But other kinds of co-occurrence are really interesting. To give you one example of something I have looked at, the presence, most inventories don't have coins in them. They don't list money at all. When you do see coins, they often co-occur with the inventories of shop owners. So it's really clear that shop owners have to have a lot of loose change because they're making change for people. So that's an interesting instance of co-occurrence. And again, note the implications of this, because where possible, every inventory should be tagged with some kind of information about the owner. It allows you to study these patterns of co-occurrence and do a social historical analysis of this. So we haven't done this yet, but we're looking at profession where listed, wealth quartile or wealth quintile, and obviously the sex or gender of the decedent. And then finally, spatial location. So we've already seen an example of the spatial location, an example of alembics, where the geospatial metadata tells us where a household and therefore the objects are actually located in European space. But I also want to come back to the fact that I mentioned earlier, named that most inventories are these room by room, proceed on room by room basis. So it's possible to actually do a spatial analysis looking at what kinds of rooms store what kinds of objects and where objects are typically found. So for example, as I was putting together the paper, I just was curious, I hadn't looked at this before, where alembics found. It turns out it's not very surprising, but they almost invariably are found in kitchens. So they're not in studies or areas that might be associated with scientific practice. They're clearly in kitchens where they're associated probably with creating alcohol for, as I said, for rose water, or possibly for preserving fruit or things like that. So that's another type of attribute or metadata that we need to attach to the objects, namely what's the room space in which they're located, and that's a really interesting type of data that we need to preserve. So I mention all this because the research questions that we're asking are really, really important for helping us define our data. And from the outset of this project, we've been pursuing the research questions as we've been trying to figure out our data structures and using the research questions to define the data structures, and of course, vice versa. Stuart, should I pause there? Is any questions? Are we good?
This is all really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think we should just keep going. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, just but interrupt anytime you want to. That'd be, then I can let my voice rest for. Cool. All right. So let's go on to. I'd like to go on to the kind of the section 2. The sandbox. This is going to be a short section because I just want to give a brief history of the project. We call this a sandbox because in effect it's a play space where we just entered for a period of 4 or 5 years to play around. So at the end of the last section, I was running over these techniques of analysis, and just to review, to perform the kinds of analysis that we want to perform, we have to add tags and metadata to all the words in the Dalmy corpus. So for example, these lexical and semantic linkages where individual words are attached to higher order lexical concepts, the geospatial information, the metadata about owners, rooms, states, stuff like that. So none of that was clear to us at the outset of this project. And for me, I have to say one of the most fascinating elements of this project lies in how much we have learned along the way. So there's been a lot of trial and error because we made a number of mistakes and we went down a number of dead ends where we had to come back out and start again. I don't regret this. It means the project has taken longer than I might have hoped. but we learned a lot from this trial and error, and it's been a super interesting part of the project. So the project emerged as I was working on this book that Stuart mentioned at the outset, Legal Plunder. For this book, I collected 100 inventories from Marseille, which have probably about 5,000 individual line items in it. And I'd also collected from the archives about 2,600 records of debt collection from the city of Lucca in Tuscany. That had about 7,000 line items in it. All this is way, way too much to count by hand. So I began, like almost everyone, by creating an Excel spreadsheet. I put all this in a spreadsheet. But soon I actually worked with an undergraduate to convert this into this FileMaker Pro database that I mentioned earlier. And this was Nathaniel Hay, who's an undergraduate at the time of the program. He's now pursuing a doctorate in history. We set up this. This is kind of a late stage version of it. What's on the screen right now represents sort of the fields we developed for objects. This took 2 years at least to develop just these various categories. But as we were creating these fields, we were encountering many challenges. One of the things, just to give you an example, some rooms are listed in those headers that I mentioned, but in some cases, you don't have a clear indication of a room. So are we authorized to create a field? Do we have to indicate the probability of that this was a bedroom and a probability interview? These are the kinds of questions we were asking. We found a lot of compound objects, such as beds with long lists of components of beds. How to handle this in this particular structure. And we began to develop this concept, this idea of conceptual entities that I've already introduced you to. The example we often give comes from the fact that there's two in the language that the Latin that a lot of our records in. There's two completely different words that mean exactly the same thing, namely blood red. So what's really clear is that these words and other words that would appear in French and German and other languages all are pointing to a supra-linguistic concept, blood redness. And this is something that we realized we had to develop a table or a supra-linguistic lexicon of material culture. And I'll be saying a bit more about that later. We also did a lot of work with georeferencing. We had some great success in the Lucca data set because it consists of records of debt collection from all over this region of Lucca. And we were able to georeference about 95% of the villages and towns that show up in this data set, about 7,000 objects. Here I'm just giving you one example, one map that we pulled out of. This is all the places where olives and olive oil were seized from the houses of debtors. It's quite interesting because you can see that they're all on these south-facing slopes. This is the town of Lucca. This is a north-facing slope. So almost all the olive production is taking place on the south-facing slope. It's actually really, I haven't done anything with this information. It was just really, really interesting. But one of the things that became increasingly clear to us as we were working with a traditional database structure, there was three big problems with this. The first is that when you put things in a database like this, there's invariably a loss of information. And I'm going to say more about this later. But the technique of normalizing data using standard nomenclatures in these fields is lossy. And we needed to find a technique for enriching the data in a manner that was lossless. And that's where we're going to go in the analysis bit, but right now I'm just explaining some of the mistakes that we made. A second thing is that the ontology that we created for this with those fields that I showed you on the previous slide, 5% of the things that we're finding just didn't fit. And we kept, do we expand these categories? Do we add new categories? Do we add a leftover category? But it was really clear that you could not come up with a standard ontology that would fit all these things. And then finally, it just took a long time even to do that small data set with the 100 inventories from Marseille. We had to do it by hand, and it was clear that this was not sustainable in the long run. So around 2018, we shifted everything onto a MySQL database that was built by Gabriel Pizzorno, and that's the back end that I'm going to show you in just a moment. And we laid the groundwork for developing a system that was going to replace the predefined fields in effect with TEI markup with codes embedded right in the data set, which is really, really cool. We're just still in the process of developing this. Let's go on to the actual Dalmy environment. So what I'm really going to get into is just show you a few screenshots of what the back end looks like and what the front end looks like. And these are things you can't see the back end right now. You have to have login privileges. So I'll just give you screenshots here. When we get to the front end, if you want to take that link that Stuart sent around, you can go in and poke around yourself at any time. The back end has three major components: a knowledge base, an image library, and a database. The knowledge base is super important. We just used this knowledge base here in effect to lay out all our standards. These include editorial standards, but also our understanding of the types of information that we're recording and what it means. We put a lot of effort into this. When we work with collaborators, they get access to this and we tell them to go. We invite them to go and look at it. It has a lot of details about some of the very specifics about the coding process. If you're doing something like this, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a knowledge base or a wiki where you store all of this information and spend a lot of time on it because it's really important. The second one is an image library. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but in effect, we store all our images in a library. I'm not going to take you into the guts of this, but every single image has an ID code, and it's got some rudimentary metadata and a folio number attached to it. So that's all in triple. That image library is capable of serving IIIF images. So the database is where the heart of the thing is. And I'm just going to walk through this quickly. I realize this is going to be super quick, so we can come back to this in Q&A if you want to know more. This area with the sources, we have a hierarchy of sources: archives, archival files, and records. What you've got here is a screen that lists the records. Again, we have 1,000 or more in here, of which 500 have been published. And for the analysis, I think I was right here when my computer turned off. In effect, on the screen here, is it? Are we seeing properly?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Great. Yeah. So I was just running through the some of the attributes of the fields we were set up. So this is where we store a lot of the essentially the record attributes and metadata. The parent field here is just a list of the archives. The thing I really wanted to pull out was this information for the locale right here, because the locale you choose goes to this lookup table where we have this really extensive list of lat longs. This is the place where all the images from the library are served directly into the record. Credits for the person responsible, sets. I'll just zip through that because it's not super important. I'll just do really quickly some of the transcription. This has been really interesting. This is what the pane looks like as you're actually editing a record. You can see we have I've picked out one that here's got some straight through text and some superscripts. And this is what it looks like in the edit mode. And in effect, what we've done, for those of you who are interested in working with TEI, we've created this whole system whereby TEI tags can be entered automatically without actually knowing the coding. It speeds up the TEI processing by probably 300 or 400%. And that's the kind of TEI that that goes into the text. What this will do, for those of you not familiar with TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, this will allow the text that's rendered on the screen to appear in a manner that's similar to what it looks like in the original record. So the front end is the one that you can all explore around, and I'll just zip through this. We use Wagtail for the content management system. It's much more powerful front end system that allows really it makes it really easy to bring data into the project. So I'm gonna go through this really quickly. We have all of our data can be browsed or filtered really simply. We've got this really powerful search tool that allows you to search for various ways of finding sources. This is the record that we were just looking at. And you can see this is how the text that I showed you on the back end renders on the front end. So what we really wanted to do was really important to preserve some of the indications of the original text in the transcription. It gives us a really good sense of the working process of how these things were put together. This is the map. You can actually enter the whole collection from the map. You can choose an area on the map that you're interested in and zoom in. I've selected Messina right here. You can just see, you can pop right into Messina and study those records if you're curious. We've done a number of features. So this is mostly, we want to keep the website fresh looking. So Laura Moriali and I mostly, we do an essay once a month or so, each of us, to explore the site for people using it. Here's the essay on Alembics, for example. And one of our most important goals has been to do a kind of expert crowdsourcing of the transcription of inventories. There's a lot of regional expertise in Europe in languages that we don't have a mastery of. So we've developed an extensive array of collaborators. This is just a tiny percentage because we haven't updated this for a while. These are mostly students and postdocs, some colleagues who actually create inventories for us, and then they get credit for so doing. Here's an example of one that Sarah Hines produced. You can see that Sarah Hines can literally copy this and put it directly on her CV because she sort of owns the records. And finally, my colleague Laura Moriali developed this really good seminar this earlier this spring, where we got about 20 people who wanted to learn how to do TEI markup and transcription of Florentine inventories. And so these people actually contributed about eight or 10 inventories to the collection from the seminar. So I'll just close with this an analysis here, because this is kind of the guts of the digital project, and probably a good introduction to where we're going with the Q&A. So this is the old FileMaker Pro that I mentioned to you. We were so this is what we developed during this what I call the sandbox phase, and one of the goals that we wanted to do was make it possible to identify all the words in our collection and connect them to lexical entries, so that would actually add the semantic information. We call this semantic parsing. In effect, what we were doing was creating ontologies. So this is the ontology right here that we developed in the FileMaker Pro database, and you can see how in the database we've had all this controlled information that we put in these fields. But as I mentioned earlier, the fundamental problem with this approach is that information is lost as it moves from the original languages into the field. And I'll just give you one example. Here, I've underlined this word, which means woolen fabric. And you can see that we put wool in this field. But in the process of putting that, we've lost some information because we've lost the actual term that was used to describe a woolen material, because this is not the only type of word that you could use to refer to wool. I already mentioned the example of sanguineous and bloodius, the blood red, but I'll skip over that just in the interest of time. That's another case where you would lose some information. Clearly the solution was not to translate. Instead, it was to enrich the data with these tags. And this is where Pizzorno is the expert. So I'll just give you my understanding of in effect, what we're doing. What I've got here, item quandam mantem domini pani coloris sanguinii. This would be an example of a line that appears in an inventory. And I've given you the translation above. A certain lady's cloak in fabric colored blood red. In effect, what we're doing, what we're going to have a machine actually do, is first of all to add an ID to this token. In other words, the actual token, this instance of sanguinii, is going to have a unique token, so it can be instantly recognizable in the entire data set. And the second thing we do is we attach the token to a headword in a lexicon with another ID number, this 300310722. That's an ID number that indicates the conceptual entity of blood redness. And I've given you the token and the headwords there. So the whole text will then be marked up. We haven't done this yet. The whole text will be marked up with these codes that actually supply semantic information embedded in the content in the actual text itself. So this is what it looks like, kind of on the lexical side. You've got the word sanguineous, which means blood red. Here in the lexicon, it would appear with its own ID. The fact that it's a part of speech is an adjective. Definition, and we could also add scope here. We can say this term is used in the data set between this date and this date, and we can list where it was. And we could also say which tokens it's currently associated with, so you can actually work backward from here. So these are, in the interest of time, I'm just going to zip through that really quickly. In effect, this is a schematic rendering of what this concept linkage looks like, from tokens that appear actually in the data set, linked to word forms. And then each of these word forms are linked to headwords in a lexicon. But then at this highest order of the conceptual entity, these things are linked under this code word that refers to an alembic. Where does the idea come from? We're using this Getty Art and Architecture thesaurus, which applies ID codes for a number of objects and attributes of material culture. Here's one that actually lists alembics. It gives you the idea code there for alembics. It locates every single object in a hierarchy, so you can actually fit it into a hierarchy of material culture. That's the ID code. Here's one for blood red. So it does colors, it does lots and lots of attributes. So if all goes well, when we finally, we're developing a machine learning algorithm to actually automate as much as possible the parsing of the corpus, because as you can imagine, it would take a long time to add all those codes manually. And that's what Pizzorno is working on. We've probably got another year or so to of work on that. But if this all goes well, we're going to have this fully actionable corpus, which can then be exported to analytical tools, all the ones that you've been learning about or ones that might be purpose-built. And as a side benefit, this is going to develop a really sophisticated search mechanism, because you can search for things in your language and automatically find the entities that you're looking for. We have plans for an image library and a virtual reality. I'm not going to say much about this here, but thank you for your patience. especially with my computer problems. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions that people have now.
Great, thank you so much, Dan, for that presentation. And I've been busily following through the Dalmy website as you've been talking and looking at different things. So it's been it's been tremendous. So we're sort of starting to get questions in, and Jeremy's also here. But I might abuse my privilege here as chair to ask a couple of opening questions, if that's okay. So I guess the first question is driven by the fact that we of course have a lot of students here, and you talked a little bit at the beginning about your sort of transition from a traditional archival historian to being involved in these digital projects. If you were to give advice to a scholar starting off, what sort of training and generally things should they bear in mind if they want to undertake this such a kind of wide-ranging project like this and contribute to it? And I have a specific question about georeferencing in cities. So presumably you have a lot of kind of, you have the name of the street they lived in, presumably you have historical maps, but I'm wondering if you're kind of going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, let me start with the first one, the last one first. So what we can't do is precisely georeference the houses, or more to the point, that would involve a research project that would be completely unrelated, which would be to actually mapping out all the houses in the cities that we work on. This has been done for some European towns. I think Paris actually, you could probably do this. You could do this in Dijon as well in France. And I just happen to know that because there's some fantastically nutty geographers who did it. So it hasn't been done for the towns that I work on. And more to the point, it would be very uneven across the corpus. There'd be some that we could do it and some that we can't do it. So at the level of the city, we're not trying to localize it really precisely. So the Lucca one that I showed you, that's a district that's I actually don't know how, but it's 30 by 40 kilometers. It's a really big chunk of territory. So that's where the georeferencing is worthwhile. And I think my guess is that it's the georeferencing across regions is going to have much more information than it will be in cities, I suspect. It's possible that we could say we think this is a suburban house or an intramural house, and that might give us some information. That's worthwhile doing. As far as advice, one of the things I talk to students here is I think that I think of there being as there being a pyramid of, let's call it digital investment. So at the base of the pyramid are virtually everyone needs to know a little bit about digital scholarship. They have to be literate. They might not necessarily need to do anything with it, but they're going to have students of their own or colleagues, and they need to know what's going on. So the base of the pyramid is very broad. There are lots and lots of people that have some. There's a middle part of the pyramid of people who need to develop expertise in something because it's relevant to their research or their interest. So it could just be this geospatial, or it could be 3D modeling, or it could be something like that. And then if that's what's important, then you can invest in that and develop the techniques for that. So for me, I guess I would say if I were starting, I'm increasingly interested in the positions higher up the pyramid, where basically you have to have programming. And because our project involves a lot of quantitative methodology and statistics, if I could go back to school now, I would take serious Python programming and some really advanced statistical work, because that's the stuff I really want to know about. I think the people at the pinnacle are the ones who are the expert programmers, and you have to do Python or R or something like that, do really advanced work. So I think, I don't know what you think, Stuart, but my sense is, first of all, figure out where you are in the pyramid and do what's important for you. You don't have to be that person at the apex, because that may not be the most important thing for you.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it, being in, within sort of different layers of a project. I mean, the way we're doing it at COHK is we're putting together a minor in digital scholarship.
Yeah.
And we have an introductory course which introduces people to a number of different sort of methodologies at the kind of Voyant-Geffy kind of level.
Yeah.
And then we have an advanced course which is focused on Python.
Yeah.
Which
Perfect. That's right.
is, I mean, if you were going in the slightly more data science direction, you would want some statistics, and they at HKU, our sister university on Hong Kong Island, they have a digital humanities undergraduate degree, and they're the people hired to teach that tend to have a sort of partly data science background, a sort of master's in data science, and then a PhD in history.
Yeah.
And I suspect that's the kind of, not the future, but that's one way certainly to square the circle.
Yeah. So Gabe Pizzarno, he's at the very apex of this, and I'm with my skill set, I'm probably lower. I'd like to be higher than what I currently am.
Yeah. Great. So Jeremy, do you have a? I see you've turned on your video. Are
you inviting me to ask questions? Because I can ask questions.
Yes, please.
So Dan, this is a really interesting project. I was most interested in this idea of what you called lossiness, and I'm not going to have you speak to that. Actually, instead, I want to ask really quickly if you could speak more about the position of Dalmi in the broader field. Are there other groups that are doing similar work, or is Dalmi alone?
Well, yeah. So I mentioned these people we're collaborating with in Antwerp. So they're doing very similar things. They're the most advanced with respect to material culture that I've met. But we also collaborate with the team in Bergamo that's doing. They're a little less material culture oriented, but they're doing a lot in the project. So the team in Antwerp, they're doing something very similar, because there's a lot of inventories from the Low Countries between about 1475 and up to the 1800. They work on the period up to about 1615 or 1625. And they've applied for a grant, and I think they stand a really good chance of getting it. Currently collaborating with an art historian, and what they're doing, which is extremely interesting, is they want to compare the famous Flemish interiors, the paintings that you get from this period, with inventories, to see whether the visual representations match what we know to have been, I'm going to use the word reality here, it's more complicated, but to the reality of households. So we're signed on with them because they've developed I would call it a fairly simple relational database, just like the one that we've rejected and moved on from, for their data. And what we're trying to do is to give them a much more robust data platform using our tools, because that's going to make it much easier to do these analysis of co-occurrence, especially spatial co-occurrence. In particular, to see whether a given object in an inventory, how spatially separated is from another object type, and then to see whether that matches what the visual representation in a painting has or not. So we're trying to come up with some quantitative measures for this, and their current data structure won't allow it because it's not as sophisticated as the one that we're doing. So they're doing something very similar. I think what we're doing is better, and I think that's why this collaboration has emerged.
I see. So is the idea to have Dalmi be like I guess the one-stop shop for data research, data-driven research on?
Well, for material culture, that's what we're really good at.
Yeah, I see.
This would not be good. We would not use Dalmi if we're trying to analyze the letters of Erasmus.
I see. I
because
see.
it's a very different, the semantic information in Erasmus is totally different from what we have. For example, we don't have verbs. We just have descriptions. So it fits a type. We're interested in working with anyone, and we have a really good approach to anyone that's doing what we call this archaeology, the documentary archaeology. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. And is there a tie-in with actual material culture and objects, say in museums? And then geolocating them based on provenance information, or is it simply from the textual sources?
Yeah, so that would be in the image library where we could actually, for certain types of things that survive either in museum collections or in archaeological stores, we could actually show images, or in some cases 3D images of actual objects. What Dalmy has is 95% of what once existed doesn't survive in hard form because most of it decays. So there's very, very little clothing for the Middle Ages. I would have said about 1/7 of the Lucca data set consists of clothing. It's about 1,000 articles of clothing. It's really phenomenally large. So I think of it as not being the same project because it's complementary. It's like two Venn diagrams. There's an area of overlap, in a sense. They have archaeologists and museums have far better information about the details of the object. So they have much richer a sense of what an object is because they can actually see it. We have a far richer set of things that once existed. What's really interesting is to compare the two. So one of the things I actually did this in Legal Plunder. No, actually I did it in another project. If you look at the archaeological record, you find that the vast majority of belt fittings were made of copper alloy. Those are the ones that you find in the ground, at least in Marseille. I did a study of belts in the Dalmy corpus in Marseille, and silver belt fittings outnumbered copper alloy brass fittings by a ratio of about 25-1. So it was really interesting because it showed that people recycled silver fittings, but they threw away the brass, in effect. So the Dalmy actually acted as a corrective to the mistaken impression that the archaeological data gave, namely that it was all in a copper alloy. There's places where they fit together really well. That's a place where they push in different directions, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess the archaeological evidence is more, if you died with it or if you threw it away, then you'll find it.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have a question here from Aster Zhao, who I believe is at HKUST. She asks
about wagtail. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Aster, thanks for the question. So we'd have to ask my colleague Pizzorno about this. We didn't do this ourselves. We hired a developer, and the developer recommended wagtail. And this was over some of the Open Scholar or some of the other platforms that are really available. And that's because wagtail, as I understand it, so I'm not an expert, is really, really good when it comes to importing complex data, in particular from this MySQL website. The other thing that it does really well is it makes it possible for the screens to resize really seamlessly as you zoom in and out, and as you use handles to drag. You could actually go in and look at this, but it handles to resize panes. So that type of thing, as I understand, is really complicated, and it's one of the things that's done really well. It also, because it's a content management system, it also means that although it's got a lot of power, it's something that we can it's got a basic type of form data where we can add new content to the website where non-experts, including myself, can add content to the website without much difficulty. So it actually, it crosses the spectrum. It's not as easy to use as some content management. It's not as good as some, but I think it's mostly for the data.
Okay. And so we maybe have time for one more question before 11:30 here. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the images of the archival documents and any sort of challenges you have in. I mean, presumably you're sourcing documents from many different European archives. You're then sort of publishing them. They're presumably then downloadable on your site. I'm wondering what it's sort of any logistical and also presumably financial challenges to that as well. I'm not quite sure how the project is funded.
So the images, in particular, copyright and permission is the issue here. That's a fascinating question, Stuart. We've only got 2 minutes, and I could spend hour just talking about that one. But so we did a lot of research to find out where it's possible and where it's not possible. So both France and Italy now have national laws saying that all content in public archives has to be publicly accessible in nonprofit circumstances. They do require a permission statement. It's now standardized for both countries. So if you were to look at one of the images, you'd see there's a watermark that appears at the bottom of the image that identifies the permission. Reproduced from the consent of the Ministero dei Beni e Culturali, and in France it's something similar. So in the database, there's a whole rights section which lists all of these rights, and the rights are attached to each archive, and it tells us exactly what we can and cannot do. So there's some Spanish archives. If you go into the database, if you go into the front end right now and you click on some records from Valencia, you will see that we don't have permission right now to publish the image, because in Spain, all the images all the archives are still private. They don't have a national policy. So we don't have permission there. So we use it on our non-public. It's in the database, you can work with it, but there's an embargo. In effect, we just tick a button that says this image cannot be at present published. So that this is part of this really elaborate backend that's part of this IDA initiative that's super handy and useful. That's why the whole platform is, we're really trying to find collaborators who can use it and help us share the maintenance costs.
Fantastic. Yeah. So yeah, it's almost like a sort of dissertation embargo system, and whenever the rules in Spain change, you can just untick the box, and that's great. That's great. It's a very sort of sustainable model.
Very sustainable. Totally.
Yeah. Great. So I see it's 11:30 here.
Yeah.
It's rather
Again,
late.
my apologies to all of you for dropping out there temporarily, but I'm glad it came back to life.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to end the semester. We have, just for everyone's information, we have another person with a Harvard connection, Michael Twarwick, who's going to be speaking to us on January 16th at our final event on digital scholarship and entrepreneurship, which should be a very, very interesting way to end this series, end the first year of the series. I guess all that remains to me is to thank our speaker, Professor Dan Smail, and to wish everyone good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you happen to be in the world.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.